It's time to set those winning lineups. I'm Jen Piacenti with Sports Illustrated, and joining me today, our senior fantasy analyst, Michael Fabiano. Fabs, let's kick it off with the quarterback position. You say it is the week to start Tom Brady, despite whatever else might be going on with Tom Brady.
Yeah, the off-field stuff, of course, will have some sort of impact. I liked him last week, and he had a huge game against the Kansas City Chiefs. I'm playing him against Atlanta. This should be a game where the Buccaneers can do very well offensively. Their defense has given up nearly 19 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. Brady averaged over 29 points per game against them last year. So Tom Brady should be back in your good graces. And I like Joe Burrow again. He's had a couple of very good games in a row. Now he's got the Ravens. Their defense is allowing an average of 22.5 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. That's most in the National Football League. Joe Burrow should be in your starting lineup.
Now, you don't feel as strongly about Matt Stafford versus the Dallas pass rush.
I don't know what's going on with Stafford. Is it the elbow? Is it the offensive line? Is it a combination of both? Right now, Matthew Stafford is unstartable, or even at this point, Jen, maybe droppable. I mean, he's had 2 straight games with no touchdowns. He had 27 straight games before that where he threw at least one. And now he's got a brutal matchup against our beloved Dallas Cowboys and that ferocious pass rush. So Matthew Stafford right now is a guy that I just cannot play in fantasy leagues. Now, the same might not be said for Geno Smith, who's coming off a monster game. He was great last week, but that was the Lions. And Geno, I'm sorry, I still don't believe. I need to see more, and I need to see it against a good defense. And that's what Geno's playing this week, the New Orleans Saints. Their defense has allowed only one quarterback to score more than 12.9 fantasy points against them in their last 8 games overall. This is a bad matchup for Geno. Don't chase the points.
Geno has the highest completion rate in the league right now. It'll be very interesting to see if that remains the case after facing the Saints this weekend. All right, moving over to the running back position. James Robinson gets the Houston Texans, so we got to start him, right?
Yeah, this is a dream matchup. And Robinson was bad last week, but it was really his first bad stat line all season long. 2.9 points against the Eagles, but that's the Eagles. Houston's brutal. I mean, they have been smashed by running backs. 6 total touchdowns allowed, 32.8 fantasy points per game allowed to running backs. That's the most in the National Football League. James Robinson should be in your starting lineup. And so should Damian Harris. Like, I know we're not talking much about the Patriots because their offense is just not very good, but he has quietly put together 3 pretty good games. And I like him as a flex starter this week against the Lions. They've given up an average of over 30 fantasy points per game to running backs. They just got boat raced by Rashad Penny last week. So Harris and Ramondre Stevenson, both good options for fantasy managers who need a flex.
Now, it's not like there are a lot of running backs out there right now that are performing really well, but you do have a few that we should sit if we're able.
Yeah, and Ezekiel Elliott, he's been to sit him almost every week. And unfortunately, he's only had one good week all season long. Last week, it was not very good. He scored fewer than 11 fantasy points in 3 of 4 games. He's got the Rams this week. They've allowed 1 touchdown and the fewest fantasy points to running backs this season. I just can't trust Zeke right now unless I'm desperate for a flex. And then let's stay with another NFC East running back, and that's Antonio Gibson. Now, we heard reports this week that Brian Robinson's been cleared to practice. Whether or not he plays this week, we're unsure of that. But if he does play, that means a smaller touch share for Antonio Gibson. Even if Robinson is inactive this week, Gibson is still a guy that I don't trust as more than a flex. His numbers have been declining. His snap share has been declining. His touch share is declining. And Jen, his value obviously declining as well.
Moving over to the wideout position, you say fire up Christian Kirk and Chris Olave, the rookie, this weekend.
Kirk had a bad week, and just like James Robinson, it's fine. You're not going to put up a monster stat line every single week. I like Christian Kirk to bounce back this week against the Texans. They've given up big games to Michael Pittman Jr., Mike Williams, Cortland Sutton. Their defense is not terrible, but they can be had by good wide receivers, and Christian Kirk is a very good one. And then Olave, you just mentioned it. This kid has seen 33 targets and scored 50.4 fantasy points over his last 3 games. Whether Michael Thomas is out again or not does not matter to me. I love the matchup against Seattle. They just gave up over 20 points to Josh Reynolds of all wide receivers. So Chris Olave is in that wide receiver 2 flex mix.
There's a new quarterback in Pittsburgh, but they're facing the Buffalo Bills. So how do you see this shaking out, and what should we do with those Pittsburgh wide receivers?
Deontay Johnson has scared me all season long with Mitch Trubisky under center. Now, is it good that he's got Pickett now as the quarterback? I think it could be. But one thing that I saw last week that I didn't like is that when Pickett played, he was targeting George Pickens a bunch. And Deontay Johnson ended up with 4.2 fantasy points. Now, I don't know if that's going to be the case week in and week out, and DJ will still see his targets, but he's also got a pretty bad matchup against the Bills this week. They've allowed just 2 wide receivers to score more than 9.1 fantasy points against them, and one of them was Cooper Kupp, who smokes everybody. So I would say, Jen, beware Deontay Johnson this week. He's not a firm sit-em, and neither is DJ Moore, but another guy that I would beware, right? Last week, he had 12.1 fantasy points. Okay, that's not terrible, but it's not great. We thought better things were ahead with Baker Mayfield under center, but they haven't been. And now you've got the Niners. Their defense has allowed 2 touchdowns and an average of fewer than 18 fantasy points per game. The receivers lined out wide. DJ Moore is a risk.
At the tight end position, I know a lot of people that drafted Kyle Pitts early have been pretty disappointed in his usage this year, but you say fire him up this weekend versus Tampa Bay.
I'm going to trust him. And he's not a trustworthy tight end right now, but how many of the tight ends in the league are? I mean, unless you have Tyler Higbee or maybe Gerald Everett, maybe a Zach Ertz, I think you still have to play Pitts. And I get it. He's been a dud for 3 of the first 4 games, but the Buccaneers defense is giving up 9.7 fantasy points or more to 3 different tight ends this year in their first 4 games. I get it. One of them was Kelsey. Still, the numbers are the numbers. Pitts also averaged over 10 fantasy points in 2 games against them. And if I get 10 points from Kyle Pitts, it's not bad. So I would still fire him up, again, unless you have someone like a Zach Ertz on your team or a Tyler Higbee, or maybe even a Gerald Everett, who's been very good, right? 12.3 fantasy points per game in his first 4 games. Now, if Keenan Allen comes back this week, that hurts Everett a little bit. If he doesn't, I think Everett's a very good play, a top 12 play against the Browns, who gave up 10 fantasy points to Tyler Conklin in week 2. Overall, they've been pretty tough on tight ends, but we're talking about Justin Herbert here. He's sort of a matchup quarterback. He's never been a guy that you need to worry about who his opponent is. So I still feel good about Everett as a top 12 option. Once again, if Keenan Allen is back, I still like Everett. Maybe he's out of the top 12, but he's still a borderline tight end 1.
Now, you're not trusting Taysom Hill this weekend, despite the fact that maybe they're rolling with Andy Dalton and maybe he even goes in as a backup quarterback or for special packages. Guys, this is so tempting, but you say don't fall for it.
And that's the caveat. Right now, we don't know who the quarterback is going to be for New Orleans. If it's Jameis Winston, I'm not touching Taysom Hill because I don't know that they're going to utilize those packages as often. If it's Andy Dalton, then maybe it's tempting. I mean, Jen, he still only played 12 snaps last week. That's it, right? I mean, he hasn't played more than 15 offensive snaps in a game. So unless you're desperate, I would keep him on the waiver wire or on your bench. But if Andy Dalton's the starter for the Saints this week, then I feel a little bit better about him. I'd still probably sit him. And I'm also going to sit Robert Tonyan. Tonyan's actually been pretty good lately. 19.9 fantasy points in his last 2 games combined. And, of course, the Packers, they don't have these great wide receivers anymore. Devontae Adams isn't there. But Romeo Doubs is starting to pick up some steam. Alan Lazard's had a good game last week. The matchup's not great, though, against the Giants. Their defense has allowed 1 touchdown to a tight end in their last 8 games. And overall, the position is averaging just 7.8 points against them in 2022. So Tonyan is a guy that, if you're desperate, I can see playing him. I don't love the matchup.
Fantastic advice, as always, Michael Fabiano. For all of Fabiano's start sits for this weekend, quarterback, wide receiver, running back, tight end, defense, and yes, even kicker, we've got them at si.com/fantasy. But don't go away before you hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss anything from si.com/fantasy.